I will go into descent and
Do you want the hills?
this will be the start of this.
I'll be putting in the low here.
Welcome back to another episode in our Inside the Mine series with the Adventra. On this trip, we had arrived in the afternoon into Thompsons Dam and we were making our way down towards O'Toole's Flats campground. We thought that we'd take the more difficult track even though it had been lightly raining earlier in the afternoon. So we decided to take the track down Pheasants Creek and then onto Flats Track, which eventually leads out to Donnelly's Creek Road, less than a kilometre away from the campground. My only real concerns about this track was in some sections it is a 30-degree vertical angle followed by cliff edges on some of the turn sections.
How you feeling, Dad?
Push it, push it, push it.
All right, I reckon he's enjoying this immensely. Got a nice smile on his face. Concentrating.
It's a little slippery, just beware.
So at this point I realised that the track's probably going to be a little bit more slippery than I first anticipated. Generally, when I feel like that the traction might be a little bit slippery, I always check outside my driver's window to see how much mud is being collected on my tyres. It's always a great indicator.
What on earth is that?
You're in first low.
Just make sure your seatbelt, you might, I'm just not sure about this.
You want me to put my seatbelt on?
Meanwhile, in the back seat, you can hear my son eagerly excited about what's about to happen.
Do you have an angle thing in your car, Dad? No, not in this one we don't.
Yeah, well, we're at 25 at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to get one for my car. I like to monitor that. Series did? Yeah, that was in build. Chris has got one that he's put in.
So right now, I'm just steering the car out of the grooves just to see what type of traction I have. I think it's very important that you kind of know how your vehicle is situated on a track at all times. That way, if something happens, you know how to respond accordingly. And you immediately have an expectation of how the vehicle is going to respond to those inputs. It was this point that I thought I'd change the camera angle so you guys can get a better idea of the depth from on top of the windscreen level.
The hill descent's still holding it.
So I guess you guys can hear the wheels kind of skipping. That's essentially the hill descent control applying brakes to a wheel and the surface of the terrain kind of sliding beneath the vehicle. It's kind of an eerie feeling, but it seems like the hill descent control seems to manage it quite well. On this particular section it gets quite steep momentarily, and you can just see here the Adventra seems to struggle to manage the brakes with the automatic hill descent, so I manually took over.
You probably want to do one at a time down here, guys.
And around a minute's passed by as we're descending, and you can just see the bottom where it flattens out here. Once we make it down to the bottom, I just pull over and I grab my camera because the vehicles were coming down one by one. I thought I would go see how Marty was doing.
You took off a bit down that first bit. Yeah, because I got to let the hill descent pick up on it, but the fact my tyres are building up like that, very scary.
Yeah, because they're not clean. Yeah. I put the brakes on up the top.
No,
you didn't want to stop.
It'll pull you to the side too, that track, because it's quite soft.
So,
it's weird, because the hill descent, you know when you normally brake, and then you start sliding? It's like it lets the outside wheel turn, and it only brakes the wheels to try and steer you back on. It's weird.
Your wheels were doing that.
Yeah.
And as soon as one went in the air,
Yeah.
it stopped.
Yeah.
And the other one was going.
It's weird stuff. But that's I haven't been down this ever when it's a little bit wet. It's always been fully dry, so
Yeah, it's only went down about that far though.
yeah.
Because you see where you picked up, it was dry underneath.
Yeah.
If you did start skidding, you would push up the dry stuff and get the grip again.
Oh yeah, it's when you don't start slowing down is the problem.
Yeah, I don't know. These tyres are supposed to have good
Ejection?
yeah.
But it won't without speed though. Oof, Will, you're coming down fast. Oh, slow the fuck. You in a hurry somewhere, mate. Jesus.
Take like 2 steps and like whoosh.
I reckon he went about 1.5 meters. He just kept slipping down that hill. Right at that top there.
Yeah.
You've got the old feet coming down and change and get like a
and 40 degrees.
Just under 40.
Yeah.
Because everything, I know, because everything in our car started moving down.
So other channels, they almost run over their cameraman taking him out. This cameraman takes himself out.
The thing is,
The good thing about this track is you get a lot of up and down action no matter which direction you're heading. This particular section here though was interesting because the 4-wheel drive behind us got hung up coming up this section, which you'll see in a moment. To help remember where we are in the video, just remember where this arrow is pointing at for reference later. So then, moments after I said that I'll just wait up here, the 78 series reported that he was getting hung up and he couldn't get up. So I decided to run down with the camera to see what's going on.
That's how we're going up a steep angle. The trip carrier's having some trouble for some reason here. I'm not sure what the issue is. Whoa! Okay, slippery. You locked them in?
Yeah, both locked in.
The view is just amazing out here, guys. Look at that. Alright, trip carrier's coming up.
Long story short, the lockers weren't engaged on the troop carrier, but we couldn't get them working anyway, so he was kind of stuck trying to just give it a run up until he eventually made it up partial amount of the way. Goes to show you how much the cross track actually does help when it comes to braking the spinning wheel and moving power to the wheel that actually has traction and climbing hills such as these.
It gets better. It gets easier. Whoa. Nope. The rear's definitely not locked.
Anyway, eventually Marty ends up getting the rear lockers in finally, and he just walks on up.
Are they locked now? Yeah, you might be locked now.
Anyway, now it's the 90 series turn, and he has a working rear LSD, so we figured he'd have no problems.
Yo! You're on your own!
So I was so confident that the 90 series would just go up that when it started to come to a stop, I just jumped off. Will looks a little confused as well, as was I, which was surprising since he had a rear LSD and he kind of got hung up in a similar spot, which goes to show you it's a combination of tyres, lockers, in our case brake lock differential systems on the Adventra that helped really get up. And at this moment, as you can see, the rain's starting to kind of drizzle down on us, making what's already slippery just more slippery.
Nah, double. No. There's no harm in double angles. Just going to.
Will took a few more attempts at this in the 90, but it just wouldn't go up, so he had to back it down quite a little bit and give it a bit of a run up with some momentum, and he finally made it up. The thing is, with all-terrain tyres, you kind of don't get the same ejection properties as a mud terrain. So whilst they were kind of climbing up slowly, I don't think they were getting enough wheel spin to eject and collect more traction climbing up. With the extra speed and the high RPM, you see straight away that the four-wheel drives just slowly walked up once they had some type of traction.
Now, you weren't locked at the start, Marty.
But the rear diff started to lock in the end, didn't it?
Must have been. Because when you got traction, I saw both turning. I wasn't looking.
So it began raining, and I grew a little bit of concern, mainly because we were still on Pheasants Track, and I know that Flats Track up ahead on the descent is quite rutted in some places, and you also had to turn at the end of a lot of descents where there's just a cliff edge if you don't stop, pretty much. So we meet the end of Pheasants Track here, and we're about to turn left onto Flats Track, which will take us down to Donnelly Creek Road, which brings us very, very close to our campsite. Right now I've just got the hill descent control on the slowest setting, and we're just going down this hill as slow as possible. At the end of this there is a sharpish turn that you want to make sure you're going as slow as possible, otherwise you pretty much will just come off the edge. If you want to see what happens when hill descent control fails in the mud, there'll be a video in the top right hand corner you can click right now to see.
Now you've got two things here. You've got to go around the corner really slowly. Wheel on the right hand side, there is a drop, and it's going to feel really spastic if you fall into it front. You can't fall into it.
With the Adventra having very little articulation, rutted conditions going downhill in the wet, all combinations for disaster. So this was my most biggest concern of Flats Track, going this way in the wet, and you'll see shortly once I clean the camera here how that actually responds.
Well, the plus side is I haven't got very many places to go other than this tree, so that's a pro.
It's really quite unfortunate actually with the GoPro on Hypersmooth 3 and high stabilization. You can't tell how jittery and jumpy this track actually is, but currently we're at around about 30 degrees on a descent, and it's bouncy and jumpy as anything. Very nerve-wracking, but at least very little can go wrong because there's so much area for us to run into if things get a little bit out of hand. And now's a great time to remind you to check out that view. That's beautifully amazing. Even though it's cloudy and raining, it's very, very peaceful. And now that we've returned to a normal descent of around 15%, I'll just speed the video up here until we get to the point where I experience some brake fade finally, which I actually have never before in the Adventra, as I'm generally extremely cautious, and I thought with the cool weather we wouldn't really have that problem, but the system does eventually give us a warning around about here. So once I finally came to a stop here, we just hit the handbrake, put it in the park, and we just hung up the car to cool down a little bit here. Now, something that's interesting that's never happened before is normally the Adventra will give us a brakes hot warning, and then you generally have maybe, I would say, less than 30 seconds to find a spot and park it up on a flat surface. In this particular case, I actually got the brakes hot warning about maybe 5 seconds before the car just started to pick up speed. So I assumed that the brake fade kicked in, and essentially we had very limited braking power. All very scary. It's essentially from this point onwards, whenever I get a brake fade warning now in the Adventra, I pretty much come to a stop as soon as I can.
Didn't like that. Alright.
After letting the brakes cool down, we head off again, heading down Flats Track on the slowest setting on the hill descent. Sorry about the camera cleaning, guys. It was raining more than I expected, and I don't really have a anti-rain casing that you put around the GoPro, so right now you can't really see it in the video, but our horizontal and vertical angle is quite off center. If you remember, around about 20 seconds ago in the video, we came off a cross axle lip and we picked up a little bit of speed. Now this corner here turning left is quite sharp. You'll see here that I actually have to brake, reverse and straighten up to make it around. However, if you were to have come down this hill too fast and you tried to make this turn too sharp, you have a very high risk of coming off the edge there to the right. Or if you experience any type of braking problem coming down that hill and you weren't prepared, you could end up in a really, really bad situation, which is why I say to everyone, make sure no matter what vehicle you take off-road that you understand the limits they're in and the conditions of the track. On this particular day, I think we probably overextended comfort limits, and in future I'll be definitely considering weather into factor when taking tracks that are of this grade in the Adventra.
Have they got cows at those schools yet?
And now we're on approach to the end of Flats Track. This will be a Y junction that appears. You can go left or right. Both will take you to Donnelly's Creek Road. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already. And if you got something valuable out of this video, hit the like button, leave a comment down below, and thank you for watching, guys. This is All Terrain Action.